Welcome to Woo English, where you can learn English through captivating stories. In today's video, we'll dive into a fascinating story that will help you improve your listening, comprehension, and vocabulary skills. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to hit the like button. Leave a comment to share your thoughts, and subscribe if you haven't already, so you never miss out on new lessons. Let's improve your English together, one story at a time. Eleanor Roosevelt. A name known to the world. But do you know her story? Born into wealth but surrounded by heartbreak, she faced tragedy at a young age. Orphaned, insecure, lost. But that wasn't the end. Her life took twists and turns that would make her one of the most powerful voices for human rights the world has ever known. She stood by her husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, through the shadows of polio, led the charge for justice and equality, and faced down the darkness of war. But it wasn't just about the battles she fought. It was about the strength she found in herself. How did a shy, quiet girl become a global champion of human rights? What moments tested her? What secrets did she carry? Stay with us to discover how Eleanor's story unfolds and how her fire never stopped growing. Chapter 1. A timid beginning. In the heart of New York City, in a grand house filled with chandeliers and velvet curtains, a little girl named Eleanor Roosevelt was born. She came into the world with wealth, with privilege, but not with love. Her mother, Anna, was a striking woman, admired for her beauty, her elegance. But Eleanor was different. She wasn't like her mother. She was awkward, timid, and her mother made sure she knew it. Anna called her Granny because of her serious face and old-fashioned ways. Eleanor, with her round glasses and quiet nature, never quite fit her mother's idea of a perfect daughter. She longed for approval, but all she received were cold words and harsh looks. Her father, Elliot, was her only source of light in those early years. He adored her. His love was warm, real, everything she craved. To Eleanor, he was a hero, larger than life. He would sweep her into his arms and promise her the world. "My little Nell," he would say, his voice full of affection. When she was with him, she felt safe. She felt loved. But even heroes, even the brightest lights, can fade. Elliot Roosevelt was a troubled man. His demons, alcohol, illness, slowly took over his life. And Eleanor, she watched him slip away. At just 8 years old, Eleanor's world shattered when her father died. He was her everything. And now, he was gone. But the loss didn't stop there. Not long before, her beautiful mother had passed away too. Pneumonia, they said. And now, little Eleanor, so young, so vulnerable, was left with nothing but memories of the parents who once were. Orphaned. Alone. She felt the weight of the world on her small shoulders. And the house that had once echoed with the sound of her father's laughter now felt cold. Empty. Eleanor was sent to live with her grandmother, a strict, emotionless woman who ruled her home with an iron fist. The house was dark, the rules endless. The warmth Eleanor had once known with her father? Gone. In its place were whispered criticisms, judgmental stares. Eleanor's world grew smaller, quieter. She became a shadow in her own life. She walked the halls of her grandmother's house as if she didn't belong there, because in truth she didn't feel like she belonged anywhere. Every step she took felt heavy. Every breath, a reminder of how alone she truly was. And the sadness? The sadness was like a heavy blanket, wrapping around her, day after day. But somewhere deep inside that sadness, inside that timid, unsure little girl, a fire was beginning to burn. A small flicker, barely noticeable at first. But it was there. Eleanor had learned in those dark days how to survive. how to hide her pain, how to keep moving forward, no matter what. She hid her tears behind her glasses, her quiet demeanor. No one saw the sadness, no one saw how much she hurt, but Eleanor knew, and that pain, that loss, it became the source of her strength. It was in those lonely days that she began to understand what it meant to be truly empathetic, to see and feel the suffering of others. She began to spend time with people who needed help, who were lost, like she was, the poor, the sick, the forgotten, and in their pain, she found her purpose. She may have felt invisible in her own home, but out in the world, she saw people who needed her. She realized that her heart, so broken, so fragile, was actually strong, and it could make a difference. But before she could change the world, she had to learn how to stand up for herself. She had to find her voice, buried deep inside her. And that voice, it wasn't going to come easily. She was sent to Allenswood Academy in London, a boarding school far from home. There she met someone who would change her life, Mademoiselle Marie Souvestre, a fierce woman, full of wisdom and power. She saw in Eleanor something no one else had ever seen. "You have more strength than you know," she told her, her voice sharp but kind. "You will learn to use it." Eleanor didn't believe her at first, but slowly, under Mademoiselle Souvestre's guidance, she began to blossom. In London, Eleanor was no longer just a quiet girl with sad eyes. She began to ask questions, to challenge the world around her. She learned to think deeply, to care about more than just her own pain. She started to realize that she could make a difference, that she had something to offer the world. Those early days, those dark, lonely days in New York, had shaped her. They had taught her how to be strong. And now, in London, Eleanor was beginning to find that strength. But even with all this new knowledge, even with her newfound confidence, Eleanor still carried the weight of her past, the loss of her parents, the pain of feeling unloved. It would never fully leave her. It would always be there, like a shadow following her through life. But instead of letting it break her, she chose to use it. She turned her pain into compassion, her loneliness into empathy, her brokenness into strength. And so, Eleanor Roosevelt began her journey, a journey that would take her far beyond the walls of her grandmother's house, far beyond the expectations that had once confined her. She would go on to change the world, but she would never forget the timid girl she once was. That girl, the one who had been abandoned, overlooked, was still there, deep inside her. Because that was where her strength had come from the darkness, from the sadness, from the quiet strength she had learned to carry, all alone. And so Eleanor's story, one of heartache, resilience, and ultimately triumph, began with that timid beginning. But the world was about to see just how strong, just how unstoppable Eleanor Roosevelt could truly become. The fire inside her was still growing. Chapter 2. London's Awakening. At the age of 15, Eleanor Roosevelt left behind the cold, familiar streets of New York and stepped onto a ship bound for London. Her heart raced with nervous excitement. Allenswood Academy awaited her, a place far from everything she had known. She didn't know it then, but her life was about to change forever. The moment Eleanor arrived at Allenswood, the difference was stark. The air was fresher, the world felt bigger, and for the first time, she felt a sense of possibility. But Allenswood was not just any school. It was a place of transformation, a place where young women were encouraged to think, really think. And the woman who would guide Eleanor through this transformation, Mademoiselle Marie Souvestre. Mademoiselle Souvestre was a force of nature. She wasn't like any teacher Eleanor had ever known. She was sharp, demanding, and she believed in the power of the mind. She challenged her students, asked them difficult questions, made them face ideas they had never considered before. And for Eleanor, who had spent most of her life feeling small and overlooked, it was like someone had opened a door inside her she didn't even know was there. Eleanor sat in her first lesson with MLL. Sylvestre, her heart pounding. The room was quiet, except for the sound of Mademoiselle. Sylvestre's footsteps, tapping lightly across the wooden floor. She looked at each girl in turn, her eyes piercing, as if she could see into their souls. And then she spoke. "You, Miss Roosevelt," she said, her voice steady and firm. "What do you think?" Eleanor froze. Her? What did she think? No one had ever asked her that before. She had always been the quiet one, the one who stayed in the background, listening, observing. But Mademoiselle Sylvestre didn't want silence. She wanted to hear Eleanor's thoughts. I'm not sure," Eleanor replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Mademoiselle Sylvestre raised an eyebrow, her lips forming a thin smile. "Not sure? Then think harder. You do have thoughts, Eleanor. You just need to find them." And so began Eleanor's awakening. At Allenswood, Eleanor wasn't just taught facts or figures. She was taught to challenge ideas, to question the world around her, to use her mind as a tool. Every day, Mademoiselle Sylvestre would push her a little further, a little harder. "Why?" she would ask. "Why do you think this? Why do you believe that? Never accept anything without asking, why?" The more Eleanor thought, the more she began to see the world in a new light. Her mind expanded, her confidence grew. She began to speak up in class, to share her thoughts with a boldness she had never known before. And with every word, with every question she asked, that timid girl, the one who had been so unsure of herself, so afraid of judgment, began to fade away. One evening, after a particularly intense discussion, Eleanor sat alone in her room. She stared out the window at the vast London sky, her heart full of something she couldn't quite name. It was as if the world had opened up to her, revealing all its beauty and complexity. And for the first time she felt like she was part of it. But the real change was deeper. Inside her. Eleanor had always been sensitive to the struggles of others, always felt a deep empathy for those in pain. But now she understood that she had the power to do something about it. She wasn't just a bystander, watching life happen to other people. She could shape the world, influence it. Mademoiselle Sylvestre had shown her that. "You are stronger than you think," Mademoiselle Sylvestre told her one day, her voice filled with certainty. "You have something inside you, Eleanor, a strength, a compassion that few possess. You must learn to use it." Those words stayed with Eleanor. They echoed in her mind, filling her with a sense of purpose she had never known before. She was no longer just Eleanor, the quiet, awkward girl from New York. She was Eleanor Roosevelt, a young woman who had the power to change the world. And she was beginning to believe it. But her time at Allenswood couldn't last forever. After 3 years of learning, of growing, of awakening, it was time to return home. The thought of leaving this place, this sanctuary of knowledge and growth, filled Eleanor with sadness. But deep down, she knew it was time. She was ready. London had given her the tools she needed, and now she had to use them. As the ship sailed back to America, Eleanor stood on the deck, the wind tugging at her hair, the sea stretching out before her. She felt a mixture of excitement and fear. The girl who had left New York all those years ago was gone. In her place stood a young woman, stronger, wiser, more confident, but still unsure of what awaited her back home. When she finally returned to the United States, Eleanor was no longer the timid girl her relatives remembered. She carried herself differently, with a quiet strength. She no longer flinched at harsh words or judgmental stares. She had learned to trust her own thoughts, to stand tall in the face of doubt. But life in America was different. It was full of expectations, of rules and roles she was expected to play. And Eleanor, well, she was never one to simply follow the rules. She had learned at Allenswood that life was more than just fitting in. It was about making a difference. The fire that had begun to burn in her heart years ago, it was still there, and it was growing, stronger with each passing day. Eleanor had found her voice in London, but she hadn't yet discovered just how powerful it would become. As the years ahead would reveal, fate had much more in store for Eleanor Roosevelt than she could have ever imagined. Her journey was only beginning. With every step she took, with every challenge she faced, Eleanor was becoming the woman she was meant to be, a woman who would one day change the world. But for now, she held that fire close, quietly, waiting for the moment when the world would finally see the strength that had been growing inside her all along. And when that moment came, the world would never be the same again. Chapter 3. A Love to Transform the World. Eleanor Roosevelt was 20 when she met him. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, her distant cousin. He was tall, charming, confident. He had an ease about him, a sparkle in his eyes that lit up every room he walked into. And when he spoke, people listened. His laughter was infectious, and his dreams, they were as big as the sky. Eleanor couldn't help but be drawn to him. But love, real love, was something Eleanor had never truly believed in. Her mother's coldness, her father's untimely death, these had left scars on her heart. She had learned to be cautious, to guard herself against the pain of losing someone she cared about. But Franklin was different. He saw something in Eleanor that others didn't. He saw her strength, her mind, her kindness. At first she hesitated. Could she trust this feeling? Could she trust him? But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, her doubts began to fade. Slowly, but surely, Eleanor found herself falling hard. Franklin swept her off her feet. And in 1905 they were married. The wedding was a grand affair, full of elegance and smiles. But behind her veil, Eleanor felt the weight of her new life pressing down on her. She was stepping into a world she wasn't sure she belonged in, a world of politics, of power, of expectations. And yet, there was excitement too. Franklin had big dreams, and Eleanor would stand by his side. As Franklin's political career began to rise, so did the demands placed on Eleanor. She was no longer just Eleanor Roosevelt. She was Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the wife of a man destined for greatness. Her days were filled with hosting dinners, attending events, shaking hands, and smiling politely at people who didn't really see her. They saw Franklin's wife. That was her role, the perfect political wife. But Eleanor had never been one to stay in the shadows. She had dreams too, dreams of justice, of equality, of a world where everyone was treated with dignity. Beneath the calm, dutiful exterior she presented to the world, there was a fire burning inside her, a fire that refused to be extinguished. As Franklin climbed the ladder of politics, first as a state senator, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Eleanor found herself stepping deeper into the world of public life. But instead of being swept up in the glamour and power, Eleanor used her position to see the truth, to listen to the people. She visited factories, hospitals, and schools. She spoke with the poor, the sick, the forgotten. She saw the inequality, the injustice, and it stirred something in her, something fierce. Eleanor was expected to smile, to be the gracious hostess. But inside she was growing restless. She couldn't stand by and watch the world suffer. She needed to act. And so quietly she began to carve out her own path. One that wasn't defined by her husband's career, but by her own passion for change. At first it wasn't easy. She was met with resistance. People expected her to stay in her lane, to focus on being the supportive wife. But Eleanor was determined to be more than just a reflection of her husband's success. She wanted to be a force for good, in her own right. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of expectations felt too heavy to bear. Could she really do this? Could she really make a difference? But then she would remember Mademoiselle Sylvester's words, "You are stronger than you think." And with that strength, Eleanor pushed forward. As Franklin's star continued to rise, so did Eleanor's. She began speaking out, not just for herself, but for those who had no voice. She advocated for women's rights, for labor rights, for racial equality. And slowly, people began to notice, began to see her not just as Franklin's wife, but as Eleanor Roosevelt, an advocate, a leader, a force for change. But this wasn't the life she had imagined. Franklin's political ambition consumed him, and their marriage, it changed. Franklin was often away, wrapped up in his own career, leaving Eleanor to navigate the complexities of her new role. There were whispers of infidelity, rumors that broke Eleanor's heart. And yet, she stayed, not out of obligation, but out of commitment to something bigger than herself. Eleanor knew that Franklin's work was important, and she knew that she could play a role in shaping the future too. Their marriage wasn't just a union of love, it was a partnership, one that would change the course of history. Together, they were unstoppable. But Eleanor's path wasn't without sacrifice. She had to find a balance between her role as a wife and her growing identity as a leader. There were moments when she felt torn, moments when she questioned whether she could truly have both. Could she be the wife Franklin needed and still stay true to her own vision? The answer, she discovered, was yes. Eleanor began to reshape the role of First Lady, step by step. She refused to simply stand behind her husband. Instead, she stood beside him, and sometimes even in front of him. She wasn't afraid to take bold stands, even if it meant challenging the status quo. And as the years passed, as Franklin's political career took him all the way to the White House, Eleanor's influence only grew. She became a champion for the people, traveling the country, listening to their struggles, and bringing their stories back to Washington. She used her position to fight for the causes she believed in, to push for progress, for justice, for equality. And in doing so, she transformed the role of First Lady into something powerful, something bold. But even as Eleanor found her voice, as she became a leader in her own right, the fire inside her continued to grow. There was still so much to be done, so many battles to fight. And Eleanor, she was ready. Ready to take on the world. Ready to change it. Her love for Franklin had brought her into this world of politics, of power. But it was her love for humanity that drove her forward. The timid girl she had once been was gone. In her place stood a woman who would go on to transform not just the role of First Lady, but the course of history itself. And her journey was only just beginning. Chapter 4. The Shadow of Polio. In the summer of 1921, tragedy struck the Roosevelt family. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, strong, confident, full of life, was struck down by a mysterious illness. At first they thought it was just a cold, maybe the flu. But then his legs began to weaken. His body betrayed him, and the doctors gave their terrible diagnosis. Polio. Polio. the disease that crippled so many, that stole strength from even the mightiest of men. And now, it had come for Franklin. Eleanor watched as her husband's world collapsed around him. The man who had once walked with such purpose, who had climbed the political ladder with ease, was now confined to a wheelchair. His body, once so vibrant, was weakened. His legs, paralyzed. Franklin's dreams of the presidency, his ambitions, all seemed to slip away in the face of this cruel reality. But Eleanor? She refused to let him give up. The early days were filled with despair. Franklin, once so full of hope, now stared out the window of their home, his spirit broken. There were days when he wouldn't speak, days when the pain, both physical and emotional, was too much. But Eleanor, she was there. Always. Quiet, steady, strong. She became the pillar Franklin needed, the rock he could lean on when everything else seemed to fall apart. "Don't give up," she would whisper to him, her voice soft but firm. "You're still Franklin. You're still you." And slowly, ever so slowly, Franklin began to believe her. But Eleanor's role was more than just offering comfort. She became his partner in a way she never had before. Franklin's body may have been confined, but Eleanor became his legs, his eyes, his ears. She traveled across the country, meeting with political allies, attending events, and, most importantly, listening to the people. Everywhere she went, she saw the struggles of ordinary Americans, poverty, racism, inequality, the wounds of a nation still healing from war and economic hardship, and the more she saw, the more she felt. These were not just political issues to her. These were human lives, lives that mattered. Eleanor wasn't just collecting information for Franklin. She was changing, inside and out. The fire inside her, that had been burning for years, was now roaring into a flame. She was no longer just Franklin's wife. She was becoming a voice for the voiceless, an advocate for the forgotten. She traveled to coal mines, to factories, to schools in the poorest neighborhoods. She met with workers who were treated like machines, with children who had nothing but rags to wear, with families who had no hope for tomorrow. And with each story, with each heartbreak she witnessed, Eleanor's resolve grew stronger. When she returned home to Franklin, she would sit beside him, holding his hand, and tell him what she had seen. "They need us, Franklin," she would say, her voice filled with urgency. "They need someone to fight for them." And Franklin, he listened. Even though his body was weakened, his mind, his brilliant political mind, was still sharp. He began to dream again, began to see that his illness didn't have to be the end of his career. And Eleanor? She was the reason. But it wasn't easy. There were moments when Franklin's despair would return, moments when he would say, "Eleanor, I can't do this. How can I lead the country when I can't even stand?" And Eleanor, with all the strength in her heart, would look him in the eye and say, "You will lead. Not with your legs, Franklin, but with your heart." Eleanor knew that her husband still had a role to play. She believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself, and she wasn't about to let the world forget about him. So she stepped into the political spotlight, speaking on his behalf, rallying support, reminding everyone that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was still a force to be reckoned with. But as she took on more of Franklin's responsibilities, something unexpected happened. Eleanor found her own voice. She was no longer just speaking for Franklin. She was speaking for herself, for the people, for justice. Behind the scenes, Eleanor was reshaping her role, stepping into places where no First Lady had ever gone before. She wasn't content to stay in the background, to be the silent partner. She began advocating for causes she believed in: women's rights, racial equality, labor reforms, and the more she spoke out, the more people began to listen. Still, the shadow of polio hung over them. There were dark days when Franklin's condition would worsen, when the pain was unbearable, and Eleanor would sit beside him, her heart breaking. She loved him, more than words could express. And yet, she knew she had to be strong. Not just for him, but for the country, for the people who needed them both. As the years passed, Franklin learned to live with his condition, to find ways to manage his pain and limitations. And Eleanor? She continued to grow into the leader she was destined to become. She never stopped fighting, never stopped pushing for change. Her heart was forever changed by what she had seen during those years of travel, by the stories of poverty, injustice, and inequality. And she vowed, deep in her soul, that she would never stop fighting for those who had no one else to fight for them. Franklin may have been confined to a wheelchair, but together he and Eleanor became a force like no other. She was his strength, his voice, his partner in every sense of the word. And while the world saw only the man who had survived polio, it was Eleanor who had carried him through the darkest of days. The shadow of polio had changed their lives forever, but it had also revealed a strength, a resilience, that neither of them had known was possible. And the fire inside Eleanor Roosevelt, it was still growing, still burning, ready to change the world. Chapter 5. A First Lady. Like no other. The year was 1933. The Great Depression had tightened its grip on the nation, and the people were desperate for a leader who could lift them out of the darkness. Franklin Delano Roosevelt became that leader. And Eleanor Roosevelt, she became something the world had never seen before. As the new President of the United States took the oath of office, Eleanor stood by his side. But she wasn't content to simply be the smiling figure in the background. No, Eleanor had other plans. She was ready to redefine what it meant to be First Lady. From the very beginning, she made it clear. She wasn't just there to host fancy dinners or decorate the White House. Eleanor had a mission. She was there to listen to the people, to speak for those who had no voice, and to use her new position for something far greater than herself. But it wasn't easy. There were expectations, so many expectations. People wanted her to be a traditional First Lady, to quietly support her husband without making too much noise. But Eleanor had never been one to stay quiet. She started holding press conferences, something no First Lady had ever done before. She invited only female reporters to these conferences, knowing that in those days, women journalists were often overlooked. This was her way of ensuring they had a seat at the table, her way of lifting them up. And the world took notice. But that was just the beginning. Eleanor began writing a newspaper column called My Day, where she spoke directly to the American people, about their struggles, their fears, and the changes they needed to see. She didn't write about fashion or gossip. She wrote about the real issues: poverty, unemployment, racial injustice. Her words were powerful. They reached into the homes of millions, giving them hope that someone was listening, that someone cared. And she didn't stop there. Eleanor traveled across the country, visiting the places most in need. She went to coal mines, to factories, to farms devastated by drought. She sat with people in their homes, heard their stories, felt their pain. She visited with African Americans in the South who were still living under the brutal weight of segregation. She listened to them, really listened. The more she saw, the more determined she became. She wasn't just Franklin's wife anymore. She was the voice of the people. She stood up for the poor, the oppressed, the forgotten, and in doing so, she did something extraordinary. She captured the hearts of the American people. Her trips were not glamorous. She traveled in battered trains, bumpy cars, and sometimes even by horseback to reach the most remote areas. She didn't wear designer gowns or pearl necklaces. She wore simple clothes, practical shoes. She didn't care about appearances. What mattered to her were the people, their needs, their suffering. One day, after visiting a coal mining town, she returned to the White House, her face pale with anger. "Franklin, you have to do something," she said, her voice sharp. "These people are starving. They have nothing." Franklin listened, because when Eleanor spoke, you listened. But she didn't just stand behind her husband. She stood beside him, and sometimes even in front of him. There were times when Eleanor's passion for justice drove her to take bold stands that even Franklin hesitated to support. But that didn't stop her. Eleanor was fearless. In 1939, she made headlines when she resigned from the Daughters of the American Revolution, DAR, after the organization refused to allow the great African-American singer Marian Anderson to perform in Constitution Hall because of her race. Eleanor was furious. In her quiet, determined way, she took a stand. But she didn't just walk away. She helped organize a concert for Marian Anderson on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And on that day, 75,000 people came to hear her sing. Eleanor stood tall, watching as Marian's voice soared through the air, a voice that could not be silenced, just like Eleanor's. Her influence wasn't just felt in the United States, it spread across the world. She became a global champion for human rights, pushing for equality, peace, and justice wherever she went. And in her, people, ordinary people, found hope. Hope that someone in power truly cared about them. Hope that change was possible. Eleanor wasn't perfect. She had her moments of doubt, her fears. There were days when the weight of it all seemed too much to bear. But each time, she pushed through, driven by the fire inside her that refused to be extinguished. Her work was exhausting, relentless, and yet she kept going. She kept fighting. Because she knew. She knew that the role of First Lady was bigger than just one woman. It was a platform she could use to lift up others, to shine a light on the injustices in the world. Eleanor Roosevelt had redefined what it meant to be First Lady. She had shattered expectations, broken down barriers, and proved that a woman's place wasn't just in the home. It was wherever she chose to be. She wasn't just the First Lady of the United States. She was the First Lady of the people. And through it all, the fire inside her, it was still growing, still burning brighter than ever, ready to ignite the world. Because Eleanor Roosevelt wasn't just a First Lady. She was a force of nature, a woman determined to make the world a better place. And in doing so, she changed history forever. Chapter 6. A Voice for Civil Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt had always been driven by a deep sense of justice, but it was the fight for civil rights that truly ignited the fire within her. In the 1930s and 1940s, America was a country divided by race, bound by laws and customs that kept Black Americans segregated, oppressed, and silenced. And Eleanor, she could not stay silent. Her compassion knew no bounds. To her, every human being, no matter their race, their gender, their background, deserved dignity. We are all created equal, she believed. But the reality she saw, the reality she faced every day, it was far from that truth. She had seen it with her own eyes. Black families living in poverty, children barred from schools, men and women forced to sit at the back of the bus to drink from separate fountains. It broke her heart and fueled her anger. How could a nation founded on freedom and equality continue to tolerate such injustice? Eleanor knew what she had to do. She had to speak out. And she wasn't afraid to make people uncomfortable, to challenge the status quo, even if it meant standing alone. One of her boldest acts came in 1939. Marian Anderson, a world-renowned black opera singer, had been denied permission to perform at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. because of the color of her skin. The Daughters of the American Revolution, DR, the organization in charge of the venue, had said no. They had shut their doors to her. Eleanor was a member of the DR. But after hearing this news, she made a decision that would echo across the nation. With a few strokes of her pen, she wrote a letter of resignation. She could not, would not, be part of an organization that upheld segregation. "I am in complete disagreement," she wrote, her words sharp, full of resolve. But Eleanor didn't stop there. She went further. She worked tirelessly to organize a new venue for Marian Anderson's concert, one that no one could deny her. The steps of the Lincoln Memorial, a place where the message of freedom and equality rang clear. And on that spring day, April 9th, 1939, Marian Anderson stood before a crowd of 75,000 people, her voice soaring through the air like a beacon of hope. Eleanor stood with her, her heart swelling with pride. This was not just a concert. It was a statement, a powerful act of defiance against racism and segregation, and it was a victory, their victory. But Eleanor's work didn't end there. She spent countless hours meeting with civil rights leaders, with black Americans who had been silenced, overlooked. She listened, really listened. And then, she used her voice to amplify theirs. She wrote letters, gave speeches, pressured lawmakers, and fought tirelessly for change. She knew the battle would be long, that change wouldn't come overnight. But she never wavered. There were many who told her to stop, to stay in her lane, to leave the issue of civil rights to others. But Eleanor Roosevelt, she didn't listen. She couldn't. "We must do what we know in our hearts is right," she would say. And her heart? It told her to keep going. Even Franklin, her beloved husband, sometimes urged caution. He needed the support of Southern Democrats to pass his New Deal legislation, and taking a strong stance against segregation could have risked that. But Eleanor? She believed the time for waiting was over. "Justice delayed is justice denied," she told him. And she was right. Eleanor didn't just talk about civil rights. She lived it. She refused to follow the norms of the day. When visiting the South, she insisted on sitting with black Americans, defying segregation laws. She would shake hands with black men and women in public, a small act, but one that sent shockwaves through a deeply divided society. There was one moment that stood out, one moment that defined her courage. In 1938, Eleanor was visiting Birmingham, Alabama, for a conference on human welfare. The city was deeply segregated, and the auditorium was divided by a center aisle, whites on one side, blacks on the other. Eleanor, standing at the front, looked at the seats and made a choice. She moved her chair to the middle of the aisle. She sat there, refusing to sit on either side. A symbolic act, yes, but it spoke volumes. She would not be part of this division, not ever. Her actions didn't come without backlash. There were hate letters, threats, vicious attacks in the press. People called her a troublemaker, a radical. They told her to stay out of it. But Eleanor was unshaken. She knew that the fight for civil rights was the right fight. She knew she was on the right side of history, and as the years passed, her commitment only deepened. During World War II, Eleanor advocated for the rights of black soldiers, pushing for equal treatment and opportunity in the armed forces. She knew that if America was fighting for democracy abroad, it had to live up to its promises at home. The fire inside her continued to grow, driving her forward, even when the road was hard, even when progress seemed so slow. She believed that true equality was not just a dream, it was a necessity. Eleanor Roosevelt had become more than just a first lady. She had become a warrior for justice, for human dignity, for the soul of a nation. And though she did not see the full fruits of her labor in her lifetime, her voice, her courage, helped pave the way for the civil rights movement that would come in the years ahead. The fight for civil rights was far from over, but Eleanor had lit a torch, one that would be carried forward by others, burning brightly with the same determination, the same hope, the same fire that had fueled her all those years. And so Eleanor pressed on, knowing that even when the world told her to stop, she had to keep going. Because the fire inside her, it was still burning, ready to change the world, one step at a time. Chapter 7, The War That Tested the World, World War II, a storm unlike any other. It swept across the globe, shaking the very foundation of nations, of families, of lives. And in the heart of that storm stood Eleanor Roosevelt, watching the world tear itself apart, feeling the weight of every lost soul, every broken heart. Franklin was leading the nation through one of its darkest hours. He was the commander-in-chief, the president tasked with making decisions that would shape the fate of millions. But Eleanor? She had her own war to fight, not with weapons, but with love, with compassion. The world was in chaos. Sons were leaving their mothers, husbands were leaving their wives. Young men who had never seen battle were suddenly thrust into the horrors of war, facing enemies they had never imagined. And Eleanor, she couldn't stand by and watch from the safety of the White House. No, she had to go to them. She began visiting the troops, men who had been sent far from home, men who had seen things no one should ever have to see. Eleanor would walk through the military hospitals, the camps, the airfields, her heart breaking with every step. She didn't just speak with them, she sat with them. She held their hands, looked into their eyes, and listened to their stories. "Tell me what you've seen," she would say softly, her voice filled with the kind of warmth that only a mother could give. And they would tell her of the bombs, of the fear, of the friends they had lost. Some were too young to carry such burdens, but they carried them nonetheless. And Eleanor? She carried them too. She wasn't afraid of the battlefield. She was drawn to it, drawn to the places where the pain was deepest, where the suffering was greatest. She visited wounded soldiers, offered them words of comfort, and most of all reminded them that they were not forgotten, that they were loved. The war had taken its toll on everyone, but Eleanor was determined to bring some light into the darkness. She wrote letters to soldiers' families, offering them words of encouragement, trying to ease the pain of waiting, of not knowing. She knew what it was like to fear for someone you loved. She had lived through Franklin's battle with polio, and now she was living through a different kind of battle, one fought across oceans and continents, but felt in every home in America. In those war-torn years, Eleanor became more than just the First Lady of the United States. She became the First Lady of the world. Her compassion crossed borders. Her heart reached people far beyond her own country. Everywhere she went, she spread a message of peace, of unity. She believed, deeply, that love and understanding were stronger than hate and violence. She wasn't naive. She knew the war had to be fought, that there were battles that needed to be won. But she also knew that if the world didn't learn from this war, if humanity didn't change, it would all be for nothing. Eleanor's platform became a beacon of hope. She used her position to speak out against the hatred that had fueled the war, to remind people of their common humanity. In speeches and in her newspaper column, My Day, She urged people to look beyond their differences, to see the pain in others, and to fight not just for victory, but for peace. One of her most powerful moments came in 1943 when she traveled to the South Pacific to visit troops stationed in the battlefields of war. It was a dangerous trip. Many thought it was too risky for the First Lady. But Eleanor, she wasn't afraid. She knew that her presence mattered. She knew that these men needed to see someone who cared, someone who believed in them. She boarded military planes, bounced along rough airstrips, and walked through camps where soldiers stared in disbelief at the sight of their First Lady standing among them. She talked with them, laughed with them, shared meals with them. And in those moments, she wasn't just Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady of the United States. She was their friend, their mother, their anchor in the storm. One soldier, after shaking her hand, looked at her with tears in his eyes and said, "Mrs. Roosevelt, we thought no one remembered us. Thank you for coming." Eleanor smiled, her heart heavy yet full. "You are never forgotten," she whispered, knowing that those words meant more than anything else she could say. But the war wasn't just fought on battlefields. It was fought in the hearts and minds of people everywhere. And Eleanor knew that peace wouldn't come simply from winning the war. It had to come from healing the wounds left behind. She worked tirelessly to bring relief to the families back home, to support the women who had stepped into new roles, working in factories, keeping the country running while their husbands, brothers, and sons fought overseas. She reminded them that their sacrifices were just as important, that their strength held the nation together. And as the war dragged on, as more lives were lost, as the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed, Eleanor's voice became even stronger. She spoke out against the hatred that had led to such atrocities. She called for justice, for mercy, for a world that could rise from the ashes of war and become something better. The war had tested the world. It had tested Eleanor, too. But through it all, she never lost sight of what truly mattered: humanity. The fire inside her, the one that had been growing for years, now burned brighter than ever. She refused to let the darkness of war snuff it out. Instead, she used it to light the way forward, for everyone. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world was forever changed. Millions had died. Cities lay in ruins, and nations were left to pick up the pieces. But Eleanor? She knew the work wasn't over. The fight for peace was just beginning. She had seen the worst that humanity could do, but she still believed in the best. She still believed in a world where love, understanding, and unity could prevail over hate and violence. And so, even after the war was over, Eleanor Roosevelt pressed on. Her words carried a weight that could not be ignored. And her message? It echoed across the globe, reminding everyone that, in the end, we are all part of the same human family. We are all responsible for each other. The fire inside her was still growing, still burning with a passion for justice, for peace, for a world that could learn from its mistakes and rise. Chapter 8. Heartbreak and Renewal. In April of 1945, the world stopped. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president who had led the United States through the Great Depression, through the turmoil of World War II, was gone. The man who had stood so tall in the hearts of millions had passed away, leaving behind a nation in mourning. And Eleanor? Eleanor Roosevelt. She was heartbroken. For nearly 40 years they had been partners. They had built a life together, a life filled with challenges, triumphs, and dreams. Franklin wasn't just a great leader to the world. He was her husband, the man she had loved, supported, and fought beside through it all. When the news came that he was gone, It felt like the air had been knocked from her chest. She had known for some time that his health was failing, but knowing didn't make it easier. The grief was still sharp, the loss unbearable. Franklin, the man she had stood by through thick and thin, was no longer by her side. The world mourned the loss of their president. His face appeared on every newspaper, his name spoken in every household. But Eleanor? She didn't just mourn the leader. She mourned the man, the one who had smiled at her from across the dinner table, the one who had laughed with her, dreamed with her. In her darkest hours, Eleanor could have retreated. She could have stepped back from public life, quietly disappearing into the background. She could have let the grief swallow her whole. But that was not Eleanor Roosevelt's way. Even in the depths of her sorrow, she knew. Her work wasn't finished. The causes that had always driven her, the people who needed her, the dreams she still carried, they were all calling her back. And so, Eleanor did what she had always done. She pressed on. In those first weeks after Franklin's death, she found herself reflecting on their life together, how far they had come, how much they had accomplished. Franklin had been the face of leadership, but Eleanor? She had been his strength, his partner in every sense, and now she had to continue without him. It wasn't easy. The weight of loss hung over her like a cloud, but even in her grief, Eleanor found strength. She knew that Franklin would have wanted her to keep going. He had always admired her passion, her drive to fight for justice, and now, more than ever, that fire inside her was still burning, still growing. Eleanor threw herself back into her work with renewed purpose. The world was at a turning point. World War II had ended, but the scars of the conflict remained, and there was so much work to be done. The people who had suffered, the nations that had been torn apart, the wounds of racism and inequality that still ran deep. All of these needed her attention. But Eleanor's heart had been forever changed. Losing Franklin had left a hole in her soul. There were nights when she lay awake, staring at the empty space beside her, feeling the weight of his absence. Yet even in those moments of loneliness, she reminded herself, her life had been about more than just one man, one marriage. She had a mission, and she wasn't about to stop now. In the years that followed Franklin's death, Eleanor only grew stronger. She dedicated herself fully to the causes that had always been at the core of her being: human rights, civil rights, peace. She traveled across the world, speaking out against injustice, pushing for a better future. In 1946, just 1 year after Franklin's death, she was appointed as a delegate to the United Nations. It was a new challenge, a new chapter, and it was there, in the halls of international diplomacy, that she would leave one of her greatest legacies. Eleanor chaired the United Nations committee that was responsible for drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document that would forever change the world. She fought tirelessly for every word, every principle, ensuring that the declaration reflected the dignity and rights of all people, regardless of race, gender, or nationality. In those long, difficult negotiations, Eleanor's voice was a beacon of hope. She spoke with conviction, with passion. She reminded the world of its humanity, of the need for compassion, for justice, for peace. And when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was finally adopted in 1948, it was one of Eleanor's proudest moments. She had done it. She had taken her heartbreak, her grief, and transformed it into something beautiful, something lasting. She had turned her pain into purpose. But Eleanor never forgot Franklin. He was always with her, his memory, his dreams, his belief in a better world. And though she was now walking this path alone, she knew she carried his spirit with her. She carried it in the work she did, in the lives she touched. in the words she spoke. Eleanor Roosevelt had been tested. She had faced the unimaginable loss of the man she loved, the man who had been her partner for nearly 4 decades. But in her darkest hours, she had found a light that had always been within her. Her journey was far from over. There were still battles to be fought, still people who needed her voice. And Eleanor was ready. The fire inside her? It was still growing, still burning with the same intensity, the same passion that had driven her from the very beginning. She had lost Franklin, but she had not lost herself. And now, more than ever, Eleanor Roosevelt was determined to keep fighting, to keep pushing for a world where every person, no matter their background, could live with dignity, with freedom, with hope. The next chapter of her life had begun, and it would be just as powerful, just as extraordinary as the ones that had come before, because Eleanor Roosevelt was unstoppable. Chapter 9. The Birth of the United Nations. The world was shattered. In the aftermath of World War II, the pain, the destruction, it was almost too much to bear. Millions had lost their lives. Cities lay in ruins. The horrors of the Holocaust had revealed the darkest depths of human cruelty, and yet, amid the rubble, there was a spark of hope. The world was desperate for peace, for unity, for something that could prevent such a nightmare from ever happening again. And who better to help lead that charge than Eleanor Roosevelt? In 1945, as the world struggled to rebuild, nations gathered to form something new, the United Nations. It was a bold idea, an ambitious plan to create an organization that would bring countries together to resolve conflicts, promote human rights, and ensure peace. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The world had to change, or risk repeating the horrors it had just survived. Eleanor was appointed as a delegate to the United Nations. She wasn't just the widow of a beloved president. She was a voice of conscience, of justice. People knew her, respected her. And in the halls of the United Nations, Eleanor Roosevelt would carve out one of her greatest legacies. She had been through so much, losing Franklin, facing a world in turmoil. But that fire inside her? It was still burning, hotter and brighter than ever before. She knew this was her moment. This was her chance to fight for the rights of all people, everywhere. Her task? To chair the United Nations Human Rights Commission. A daunting challenge. But Eleanor embraced it with everything she had. She wasn't just drafting a document. She was crafting a vision of a world where every person, regardless of race, gender, nationality, or religion, was treated with dignity. A world where human rights were not a privilege, but a birthright. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Those words were more than just an idea. They were a promise to the world that what had happened during the war, the atrocities, the suffering, would never be allowed to happen again. But the work was grueling. Long days, heated debates. There were those who doubted, those who wanted to water down the language, to make compromises that would weaken the document's power. Some believed that human rights couldn't be universal, that they had to be shaped by culture, by politics. Eleanor? She believed otherwise. With every fiber of her being, she believed in the dignity of every human being, and she wasn't about to let anyone diminish that vision. She sat in meeting after meeting, listening, negotiating, pushing. Her voice was steady, determined. "We cannot allow ourselves to be paralyzed by fear of the future," she would say, her eyes burning with conviction. "We must build a world where every person is protected, where every life is valued." There were moments when it seemed impossible, moments when the disagreements between nations threatened to derail the entire process. Eleanor's heart would sink, but only for a moment. She knew the stakes were too high. She had to keep fighting. She had to keep pushing forward. Her colleagues on the committee saw her strength, her passion. They saw how she worked tirelessly, day after day, refusing to give up. And slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. One by one, the barriers fell. The document began to take shape. Eleanor knew it wasn't just about words on a page. It was about people, real people. The farmers in rural villages, the workers in factories, the children in war-torn countries. She was fighting for them, for their right to live in peace, to have food, shelter, education, to be free from fear. As the draft of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights neared completion, Eleanor felt the weight of history pressing down on her. This wasn't just another political task. This was a legacy, a blueprint for the future, a light in the darkness. On December 10, 1948, the United Nations General Assembly gathered to vote. The room was filled with tension, hope, expectation. Eleanor sat quietly, her heart racing. She had poured everything she had into this moment. And now, it was out of her hands. The votes were cast. One by one, the nations of the world raised their voices. The result? Overwhelming approval. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. For a moment, the weight of it all hung in the air, thick with emotion. And then, applause. Thunderous applause. The room erupted in celebration. The world had taken a step toward something better, something greater. And Eleanor, she sat there, tears welling in her eyes, her heart full. It was done. The document she had fought so hard for, the words she had defended with every ounce of her being, were now a reality that would ripple across the world, changing lives for generations to come. When asked later what she considered her greatest achievement, Eleanor didn't hesitate. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was the culmination of everything I believed in, she said, her voice full of quiet pride. It was a declaration of hope for all humanity. But Eleanor's work wasn't finished. It never was. She continued to fight for human rights, to push for peace, to speak out against injustice. The fire inside her, still growing, still burning with the same passion that had driven her from the very beginning. In those final years, Eleanor Roosevelt was more than just a former First Lady. She was a global champion, a woman who had shaped the course of history. Her name became synonymous with human dignity, with justice, with the belief that no matter how dark the world may seem, there is always hope. The birth of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was one of her greatest triumphs. But for Eleanor, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for the world. A victory for every man, woman, and child who would one day stand up and demand their rights. She had changed the world. And the fire inside her, it would never die. It would live on, in the words of the Declaration, in the lives of those she had touched, and in the hearts of all who believed in the power of human dignity. Eleanor Roosevelt's journey was far from over. But this was her legacy. Chapter 10, A Global Champion of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt was never one to rest. Even after the triumph of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, she kept going, driven by the same fire that had burned inside her for decades. She spent the rest of her life traveling the globe, speaking to presidents and peasants, kings and commoners, and no matter where she was, her message was always the same. Every human life has value. Every single life. The world looked to her as a beacon of hope. She was fearless. Where others hesitated, Eleanor stepped forward. She didn't care if it was unpopular, if it ruffled feathers. She wasn't afraid of dictators. She wasn't afraid of challenging those in power. She had seen the worst humanity could do: war, genocide, hatred, and she had made it her life's mission to fight against it. In Europe, devastated by World War II, she walked among the ruins, speaking to the displaced, the broken. She visited refugee camps, offering comfort to those who had lost everything. Children with wide, hollow eyes looked up at her, and she knelt down, took their hands in hers, and whispered, "You are not forgotten." In those moments, Eleanor wasn't just a former First Lady, she was a mother to the world. Her presence alone was powerful, but it was her words that carried the real weight. When Eleanor spoke, people listened. World leaders listened. She would stand before them, tall, unflinching, and full of resolve. "We cannot turn our backs on humanity," she would say, her voice echoing through grand chambers. "The measure of our civilization is how we treat the most vulnerable among us." And they listened because they knew. Eleanor wasn't just talking. She meant every word. But it wasn't just the powerful who sought her wisdom. It was the poor, the forgotten, the voiceless. Eleanor traveled to far-flung corners of the world, to villages where dirt roads led to homes made of mud, to cities where the scars of war still lingered in every building. And wherever she went, people flocked to see her. They had heard of this woman who fought for them, who believed in them. One day, while visiting India, Eleanor stood in a crowded market, surrounded by people who had suffered from colonial oppression for generations. The air was thick with dust, the streets buzzing with life. She stood on a makeshift platform and looked out over the sea of faces, faces worn by hardship, by struggle. And then she spoke. "You are not powerless," she said, her voice strong and full of conviction. "The strength of a nation lies in the hearts of its people. And you have the power to demand justice, to create change." Her words sent ripples through the crowd. They were more than just words. They were a call to action. Eleanor Roosevelt had a way of making people believe in themselves, of making them see that their voices mattered, that they had value. But her journey wasn't without challenges. Not everyone welcomed her message. There were those in power who saw her as a threat. She wasn't afraid to stand up to dictators, to oppose regimes that trampled on human rights. In Latin America, she confronted military leaders, demanding justice for the oppressed. In the Middle East, she spoke out against violence and division, calling for peace between nations torn apart by conflict. There were times when the opposition was fierce. There were letters of warning, threats made behind closed doors. But Eleanor? She didn't flinch. She never backed down. "Fear," she once said, "is the enemy of progress. We must push forward even when the path is hard." And that's exactly what she did. Pushed forward, relentlessly. Back home in the United States, Eleanor continued to fight for civil rights, for women's rights, for the rights of workers. She knew that the battle for equality wasn't just a global one. It was right there in her own backyard. She marched with civil rights leaders, stood with striking workers, and spoke out against discrimination wherever she saw it. In 1960, just 2 years before her death, Eleanor was asked to speak at the United Nations once again. This time, the Cold War loomed large. The world was divided, East versus West, capitalism versus communism. Tensions were high, and the threat of nuclear war hung over everything like a dark cloud. But Eleanor, as always, rose to the occasion. She stood before the assembly, her voice steady, her heart full. "We are standing on the edge of a precipice," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "The future of the world depends on whether we choose fear or hope, division or unity. Let us not forget that at the heart of every nation are human beings. We must build a future that values every human life, that protects every human right." Her words rang out like a bell of clarity in a time of chaos. And once again, the world listened. In her final years, Eleanor's body grew frail, but her spirit, it was as fierce as ever. She continued to travel, to speak, to inspire. She spent her last days working for the causes she had always championed. Even as her health faded, the fire inside her never dimmed. It was still growing, still burning, ready to light the way for the generations to come. When Eleanor Roosevelt passed away in 1962, the world lost one of its greatest champions. But her legacy? It lived on. It lived on in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the countless lives she touched, in the movements she helped spark. She had been fearless. She had been tireless. And she had shown the world that every human being, whether they were a farmer in a small village or a leader of a great nation, had value, that every life mattered. Eleanor Roosevelt had changed the world, and the fire inside her, it continues to burn in every person who believes in justice, in equality, in the dignity of every human soul. She was more than just a global champion of human rights. She was a force of nature, a voice for the voiceless, and a light that will never be extinguished. Chapter 11. A Life of Compassion. As Eleanor Roosevelt grew older, her energy, her drive, her compassion, none of it waned. In fact, it seemed to grow even stronger. She never slowed down, never stopped fighting for the world she believed in. And that fire inside her? It kept burning, burning for justice, burning for peace, burning for the people whose voices were so often silenced. She wrote books. So many books. Books that inspired, books that called people to action. She filled pages with her thoughts, her wisdom, her experiences, her relentless hope that the world could be better. "You learn by living," she wrote in 1960, offering lessons from her own life, lessons in courage, in kindness, in perseverance. It was more than just a book. It was a testament to the strength of the human spirit. And the speeches, she never stopped giving them. Even as her body grew older, her voice remained clear, powerful. Eleanor stood before crowds of people, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands, and she spoke from the heart. Whether she was addressing world leaders or ordinary citizens, her message was always the same. We must care for one another. We must have compassion. But Eleanor's compassion wasn't just something she talked about. It was something she lived every single day. She saw suffering. She had seen it her whole life, and she couldn't just look away. No, Eleanor was the type of person who ran toward the suffering, who sought it out because she believed that if she could do even a little to ease someone's pain, she was making the world a better place. There was no corner of the world too far. No group of people too small for her attention. She visited schools in poor neighborhoods, listened to the stories of factory workers, and sat with those whom society had forgotten. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. She wasn't above rolling up her sleeves and working alongside those who needed help. One moment stood out, a memory etched in the hearts of many. Eleanor, well into her 70s, visited a housing project in New York City. The buildings were crumbling, the conditions unbearable. Yet there she was, walking among the residents, shaking hands, asking questions and listening. Always listening. A young mother, tears in her eyes, grabbed Eleanor's hand and whispered, "No one cares about us. But you came." Eleanor looked at her, eyes full of empathy, and said, "I care. And I'll make sure others care too." That was Eleanor Roosevelt, the embodiment of compassion. She traveled the world, advocating for peace, justice, and equality. She visited countries torn apart by war, poverty, and oppression, but she never gave up on the belief that things could change. Eleanor believed in humanity, in its capacity for love and goodness. and she believed that with enough courage and empathy, the world could heal. But Eleanor wasn't perfect, and she knew it. She had made mistakes. She had moments of doubt, moments when she questioned whether she was doing enough, whether she was on the right path. She wasn't immune to criticism, far from it. Some people thought she was too radical, others thought she was too soft. But Eleanor, she accepted her flaws, her imperfections, and she never let them stop her from doing the work. In a rare moment of vulnerability, she once said, "I'm just an ordinary woman trying to do extraordinary things." But the truth was, there was nothing ordinary about Eleanor Roosevelt. She showed the world that you didn't have to be perfect to make a difference. You didn't have to have all the answers. What mattered was that you cared, that you kept fighting, that you didn't give up. One of her favorite sayings was, "It is better to light a candle than to curse the darkness." And that was how Eleanor lived her life, lighting candle after candle, one small flame at a time, until the darkness around her was filled with light. As the years went by, the world began to change, slowly, painfully, but it changed. And Eleanor, even in her later years, was still a force of nature. She was still traveling, still writing, still standing up for what she believed in. Her body may have grown tired, but her heart was as strong as ever. There were moments when she could have stepped back, when she could have said, "I've done enough." But Eleanor never believed in enough. There was always more to do, more people to help, more injustices to fight. The fire inside her didn't flicker, didn't fade. It kept growing, fed by her love for humanity and her unshakable belief in the goodness of people. She was a mother, a wife, a friend, a leader. But above all, she was a human being. And in her humanity, she found the strength to change the world. She showed us all that one person, no matter how flawed, no matter how broken, could make a difference. That with enough love, enough empathy, and enough courage, one person could move mountains. As Eleanor approached the end of her life, there was a quiet dignity about her. She knew that her time was coming, but she wasn't afraid. She had lived a life of purpose, a life of compassion, and she knew that the work she had done would live on in the hearts and minds of those she had inspired. In 1962, when Eleanor Roosevelt passed away, the world mourned the loss of a woman who had given so much of herself to others. But her legacy? It was everywhere. In every human rights movement, in every act of kindness, in every flame of hope that still burns today. Because Eleanor Roosevelt was more than just a first lady. She was proof that one person, no matter how flawed or broken, could change the world. All it took was love, empathy, and the courage to keep fighting. And even now, decades later, the fire inside her, it's still growing, still burning. Because Eleanor's compassion, her light, will never fade. Chapter 12, A Legacy That Lives On. Eleanor Roosevelt passed away on November 7, 1962, but her legacy? Her legacy lives on. The fire that burned within her, brighter than any doubt, stronger than any fear, still lights the way for generations to come. Today, Eleanor Roosevelt is remembered as one of the greatest champions of human rights the world has ever known. Her work, her relentless dedication, laid the foundation for activists, for advocates, for ordinary people fighting to make the world a better place. And her words, they continue to inspire, echoing through history like a beacon of hope. But Eleanor's life was not an easy one. No, far from it. She had faced hardship, deep, personal loss. She had known heartache, searing, painful heartache. And there had been doubt, times when even she, strong as she was, questioned her own worth, her own ability to make a difference. But Eleanor Roosevelt, she rose above it all. She transformed herself from that timid, insecure girl who once felt invisible into a global force for good. The world told her she wasn't enough. Society told her to stay quiet. But Eleanor found her voice, and when she spoke, the world listened. The fire inside her was never quenched. It grew, fueled by love, by empathy, by the sheer force of her will to do what was right, no matter the cost. And in transforming herself, she transformed the world. Her work was vast, her reach immeasurable. From drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one of the most important documents ever written, to fighting for civil rights, to traveling the globe as an advocate for peace. Eleanor's influence knew no boundaries. She wasn't content to stay within the confines of any single role or title. She was more than just a first lady, more than just Franklin's wife. She was a leader, a fighter, a voice for the voiceless. Her compassion? It was boundless. She gave herself to the world, heart and soul. She listened to those whom society ignored. She walked with the poor, stood beside the oppressed, and fought for those whose rights were trampled underfoot. Her life was a testament to the power of empathy, the simple, profound act of seeing another person's pain and refusing to look away. But Eleanor Roosevelt was not perfect. She made mistakes. She stumbled. She had moments of doubt, of frustration, when the fight seemed too hard, the progress too slow. Yet in every moment of uncertainty, she found her way back to her purpose. She knew that perfection wasn't required to change the world. Only persistence. Only the courage to keep going, even when the road seemed impossible. In her own words, the future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams. And Eleanor? She dreamed of a world where every person, no matter where they came from, no matter what they looked like, could live with dignity, with freedom, with hope. Her story is not just history. It is a lesson, a reminder. Eleanor's life is proof that one person, no matter how flawed or broken, can change the course of humanity. She showed us that compassion, real compassion, the kind that drives you to action, can transform not just lives, but the world itself. Her legacy teaches us that even in the darkest of times when fear and hatred seem to rule the day, love, understanding, empathy will always be stronger. Her work laid the foundation for the civil rights movement, for women's rights, for human rights movements around the globe. Her voice sparked fires in the hearts of countless individuals, fires that still burn today. She showed us the way, and it is now up to us to carry that flame forward. Eleanor Roosevelt may have left this world in 1962, but her presence is still felt. Her words are still spoken. Her example is still followed. In classrooms, students study her speeches, her writings. In the halls of the United Nations, leaders still point to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that document she fought so hard to bring into the world. And in every corner of the globe, from the smallest village to the largest city, people are still inspired by the life she lived. Because Eleanor's story, her journey from quiet, insecure child to global leader, reminds us all of one simple truth. We can make a difference. We can change the world. No matter who we are, no matter where we come from, the fire inside her, it is still growing. It is growing in the hearts of those who believe, as she did, that every life has value, that every person deserves respect, that love and compassion, no matter how difficult, are always the right choices. Eleanor Roosevelt left us a legacy of courage, of resilience, of hope, and now it is up to us to continue her work, to take that fire and let it burn brightly in our own lives, to fight for justice, for peace, for a world where every human being is treated with dignity. Her story is